In late Millennium 41, following in the wake of Abaddon the Despoiler's 13th Black Crusade and the subsequent creation of the colossal warp rift known as the Cicatrix Maledictum, the Imperial throne world of Terra would, for the first time in 10,000 years, come under assault from the forces of Chaos. The demonic legions of Khorne, the Chaos god of bloodshed and slaughter, would lay siege to the Imperial Palace, intent on breaking through the Lion's Gate and eventually laying waste to the Sanctum Imperialis. The forces of the Adeptus Custodes, led by Captain General Trajan Valoris, along with a handful of Sisters of Silence and a contingent of Grey Knights, would battle fiercely against the demonic threat. Despite their impassioned defense, the forces of Chaos quickly threatened to overwhelm Imperial forces with their sheer bestial ferocity. Thankfully, however, thanks to the timely arrival of Roboute Guilliman, the Primarch of the Ultramarines, along with the forces of his Terran Crusade, the legions of Khorne would ultimately be driven from the material realm. In spite of the fact that the forces of Chaos were willing to assault the very cradle of humanity, Guilliman would decide to not consolidate his forces in order to reinforce Terra's defenses. Instead, the Primarch would seek to launch a vast crusade in order to reclaim those worlds which had fallen victim to the ruinous powers following the creation of the Cicatrix Maledictum, preparing for what would become known within Imperial records as the Indomitus Crusade. Yet as Guilliman began to make preparations for such a monumental undertaking, the forces of Abaddon's Black Legion would begin enacting a plan of their own, one which sought to strand the newly awakened Primarch upon Terra and prevent his plans from ever coming to fruition. To do this, Abaddon's forces sought to close the 8 primary warp routes that led towards Terra from outside the boundaries of Segmentum Solar, making warp travel to and from Terra an all but impossible task. The Black Legion would begin laying siege to a number of worlds that lay within close proximity to these warp routes, before entrenching massive structures formed from a psycho-reactive substance known as Blackstone into their very bedrock. Thanks to the presence of these structures, which were in truth shards that had been harvested from the now shattered Cadian pylons, the energies of the warp would be actively repelled, causing any nearby warp conduits to effectively collapse. The Black Legion would succeed in sealing off each of the routes leading towards Terra one by one, until only the conduit at Vorlisi remained. But as the Black Legion launched their assault against Vorlisi and prepared to entrench a pylon shard upon the surface of the world, the ship tasked with transporting the shard, known as the Heartspite, would be unexpectedly boarded by a small force of custodians and Sisters of Silence who had learned of the traitor's plans. Battling their way towards the main cargo hold, the talons of the Emperor would butcher their way through countless numbers of heretic Astartes as they desperately sought to prevent them from launching the shard. Despite their incredible martial prowess, superior war gear, and sheer resilience, the Custodes and Sisters of Silence would gradually be whittled down by the sheer number of Chaos Space Marines, until only a pair of custodians, Shield Captain Valerian and a warrior named Ujamo, along with a single Sister of Silence named Tanau Aleya, remained. But as the surviving Talons prepared to make their last stand against their foes, an Imperial fleet led by Guilliman himself would translate into real space. The Black Legion forces assaulting Vorlisi would be repelled, while the Heartspite would be boarded and captured. Guilliman's forces would discover the grievously wounded but still living and still fighting forms of Valerian, Ujamo, and Aleya, who would be swiftly whisked away in order to receive urgent medical treatment. While Valerian and Aleya would make a full physical recovery, Ujamo's injuries would prove to be so severe that he would find himself interned within the sarcophagus of a Contemptor-class dreadnought. In recognition for their actions during the Battle of the Lion's Gate, as well as the initiative that they took in seeking out the Heartspite in order to thwart the schemes of the Black Legion, Guilliman would hold a grand ceremony to publicly honor both Valerian and Aleya before the citizens of Terra. Valerian would have his armor adorned with a golden ultramarine wreath, a visual representation of his new honorific title of Hero of the Lion's Gate, becoming the first warrior to receive the title since the days of the Horus Heresy. Tanau Aleya, for her actions, would be bestowed with an ancient sword known as the Somnus Blade, an executioner-style great blade, which had been forged during the time of the Great Crusade. However, before Guilliman could state as to who this blade had originally belonged to, Aleya prevented the Primarch from doing so, explaining that she felt that he had already given her far too much in the way of expectations to live up to, without also needing to be compared to some great hero of antiquity. Despite its age, the Somnus Blade is a weapon of incredible craftsmanship that has slain a countless number of the Emperor's foes over the millennia, and in the hands of Tanau Aleya would continue to do so for many years to come. But one question still remains. Just who exactly could have been the original wielder of the Somnus Blade? Given the level of prestige, honor, and respect that is seemingly associated with the blade, it seems logical to assume that the weapon had once belonged to a formidable or highly distinguished member of the Silent Sisterhood. One possibility is that the Somnus Blade had originally belonged to Genetia Kroll, the Knight Commander of the Silent Sisterhood during the time of the Great Crusade and Horus Heresy. As befitting her rank as Knight Commander, Kroll was a figure of incredible renown throughout the ranks of the Sisterhood, known to have taken part in many notable battles such as the burning of Prospero, the war within the Webway, and even the defense of the Imperial Palace during the Siege of Terra, where she would ultimately meet her demise. Not only this, but during the early years of the Great Crusade, Kroll had been bestowed with a blade that had once belonged to none other than the Emperor himself. This sword, named Veracity, the Sword of Oblivion, was much like the Somnus Blade, a finely crafted executioner great blade. Since Veracity had been wielded by both the original Knight Commander of the Silent Sisterhood, as well as the Emperor of Mankind, it's completely understandable as to why being gifted with such a weapon would be treated as such a monumental honor, should Veracity and the Somnus Blade truly be one and the same. While it would initially seem somewhat logical to assume that the Somnus Blade and the Sword of Oblivion are indeed the same weapon, there are a number of problems with this particular possibility. The first, and most notable of which, is that aside from them both being executioner great blades, these two swords sport drastically different appearances from one another. Veracity, for instance, is noted to sport a pair of parrying hooks near the base of the blade, whereas the Somnus Blade lacks such protrusions, and has the word Somnus etched along its length, an inscription that the Sword of Oblivion was known to lack. Admittedly, however, it is potentially possible that the Sword of Oblivion could have simply been reforged into the Somnus Blade at a later point in time. Indeed, the idea that the Somnus Blade had been created through the reforging of an older blade is loosely supported within the novel Watchers of the Throne, The Regent's Shadow, as Tanau Aleya would state that the very name of the Somnus Blade appeared to be a modern creation in her eyes, one given to the weapon by archivists who had forgotten its true origins. This in turn would also suggest that the inscription of Somnus, which adorns the length of the blade, was in fact a later addition, one which had been made to better coincide with the weapon's new name. But whether the sword had truly been reforged from an older weapon, or had simply been renamed and inscribed upon at a later date, is another matter entirely. However, as mentioned earlier, Kroll herself had perished during the Siege of Terra at the battle for the Eternity War spaceport, being slain by Captain Khan of the World Eaters Legion. Since this particular part of the Imperial Palace would fall to the traitor legions shortly after her death, the odds of her body, let alone her weapons or armor, being recovered by Imperial forces would appear to be fairly slim. As such, if her corpse had, for one reason or another, not been looted by the traitors following the fall of the Eternity War, her weapons and armor are most likely still buried beneath the surface of Terra to this very day. In addition, since Veracity had once been wielded and presumably forged by the Emperor himself, it would seem, for lack of a better term, sacrilegious to reforge a weapon that he himself had created, although if the weapon had been badly damaged during the Siege of Terra, Imperial artificers may have had no choice but to reforge Veracity into an entirely new form, should the Sword of Oblivion and the Somnus Blade be truly connected in some way. Alternatively, instead of the Somnus Blade having once belonged to Genetia Kroll, It instead belonged to another high-ranked officer of the Silent Sisterhood. In this case, it's entirely possible that the weapon had originally been wielded by Veronica Sulath, the Mistress of the Black Fleet. As Mistress of the Black Fleet, Sulath was responsible for the operations of the notorious League of Black Ships, vessels responsible for the capturing and transportation of psychers. It was thanks to the actions of Sulath during the war within the Webway, which saw an increased number of psychers being captured and fed to the Golden Throne, allowing the Emperor of Mankind to briefly take to the battlefield against the demonic legions, laying siege to the Terran Webway Gate. What makes the idea of the Somnus Blade having once belonged to Sulath seem somewhat plausible is due to a number of visual similarities between it and the sword wielded by the Mistress of the Black Fleet. Situated at the hilt of both swords is an eagle-like design that is highly reminiscent of the Imperial Aquila, which could hint towards the idea that both weapons are indeed one and the same. However, much like the Sword of Oblivion, Sulath's blade is shown to sport a pair of parrying hooks, in addition to a large ornamental gemstone upon the length of the blade. As well as this, the crossguard of Sulath's own sword is shown to demonstrate a slight curve, whereas the crossguard of the Somnus Blade appears to be completely straight. But again, this does not necessarily rule out the possibility that Sulath's sword could have simply been reforged into the Somnus Blade following the events of the Horus Heresy. Another possibility is that the Somnus Blade had originally belonged to an Oblivion Knight named Amandira Kendall. Kendall, much like Janitia Kroll, was a legendary figure within the ranks of the Silent Sisterhood, having participated in many notable events both prior to and during the course of the Horus Heresy. Not only would Kendall take part in the extermination of a Xenos race known as the Jogal, but she would even lead her sisters into battle against the corrupted Death Guard warrior Solon Decius, after he had transformed into a monstrous creature known as the Lord of Flies. Shortly after the onset of the Horus Heresy, Kendall would be made into an agent of Malcador the Sigillite, the Regent of Terror, who sought to recruit into his service a number of men and women known for their inquisitive natures, laying the foundations for the organization that would eventually come to be known as the Inquisition. This would even result in Kendall relinquishing her Oath of Tranquility, the vow that every woman takes upon being fully inducted into the Silent Sisterhood, which forbids them from ever speaking again. As well as this, it was during her time in service to the Sigillite that Kendall would have the unique honor of becoming the first human to declare exterminatus upon a world that had turned its back upon the Imperium. Because Kendall was not only a highly respected Oblivion Knight, but also in service to a man who was second only to the Emperor himself, it's entirely possible that her sword may very well have been the Somnus Blade. After all, much like the other women of her order, Kendall was indeed known to have been armed with a keen-edged blade, although whether such a weapon was in itself an executioner great blade, or something better akin to a more traditional power sword, remains somewhat unclear. While Amandara Kendall is indeed a potential candidate in regards to the original wielder of the Somnus Blade, the specific description given for her sword would initially appear to suggest that the two weapons are in fact separate and distinct from one another. According to the short story The Voice, Kendall was stated to have borne an eagle-headed sword, with the wings of the eagle forming the basis of the blade's crossguard. That being said, however, the Somnus Blade does feature an eagle-like design similar to that of the Imperial Aquila near the hilt of the blade, which could suggest that Kendall's sword had been reforged into the Somnus Blade at some indeterminate point in time following the Horus Heresy. But then again, it is worth noting the design and size of the eagle ornamentation displayed by both Kendall's sword and the Somnus Blade are only superficially similar to one another. In addition, because Kendall had technically left the Silent Sisterhood upon being recruited by Malcador, it's equally possible that her sword may have become forever lost to her former sisters upon becoming a true Inquisitor, although admittedly there is little in the way of actual evidence to support this particular notion. This then leads into the final major possibility in regards to the original owner of the Somnus Blade, that the sword had once belonged to a warrior whose actions proved instrumental in preventing demons from rampaging throughout the Sanctum Imperialis, Celia Haroda. During the war within the Webway, as detailed within the first iteration of the book, Visions of Heresy, a bloodthirster, a greater demon of Khorne, would break through the Imperial lines and threaten to breach the Terran Webway Gate. Before it could successfully break through into the material world and manifest within the Emperor's throne world, Celia Haroda would launch herself at the demon, meeting the beast head-on in single combat. While she would defeat and banish the bloodthirster from the material realm, Haroda would ultimately collapse at the entrance of the Webway portal, having died from both her wounds and sheer exhaustion. Since Haroda had perished in the act of single-handedly defending the Sanctum Imperialis from a rampaging bloodthirster which sought to breach the Imperial Webway Gate, it's reasonable to assume that she could have been seen by her sisters as something analogous to a martyr or saint, becoming a figure of awe and inspiration for the entire Silent Sisterhood. This in turn could have resulted in Haroda's weapons and armor being venerated in a manner akin to that of holy relics. If this were indeed the case, then this would certainly explain as to why the Somnus Blade, if the weapon had truly belonged to Celia Haroda, would be so highly revered, as a sword would have not only been wielded by a warrior who was both truly fearless and incredibly skilled, but one whose actions had in fact protected the master of mankind himself, as he sat immobile and near helpless upon the golden throne. And what greater honor could a warrior of the Imperium hope to achieve, but to be remembered giving their very life in order to defend their emperor? Because of this, the idea that Haroda's blade would eventually come to be known as the Somnus Blade is not entirely unreasonable, with such a weapon being bestowed to a warrior deemed worthy enough to carry on her legacy. Or perhaps the blade has simply belonged to a warrior of the Silent Sisterhood, whose deeds currently remain both unsung and shrouded in mystery for one reason or another. Whatever the truth may be, the Somnus Blade nonetheless remains an exceptionally deadly weapon, one that the enemies of man will soon learn to fear. But what do you think? Leave a comment below, and thanks for watching.